All right. Good evening, everybody. It is week 2, and we are talking more about organizational development interventions. But this week, you are really diving into the design and a lot of the foundation of these interventions. So we're going to just take a quick look tonight at what some of this is. So this is kind of the process, the stages of organizational development. And again, depending on what source you look at or where you're looking and when you're looking, you may find this to be, a little different. Sometimes it's presented differently, but this is generally the process. And you probably recognize some of the wording on here as some of your chapter titles or sections in chapters or things you might have seen on the syllabus. So this is obviously it all connects and makes sense because this is what we're studying. All right. And this week we are kind of in this 5 here, 5th stage, which you'll notice, obviously, it's not till chapter 7 in your book. And some of these things may happen in unison. Some of these stages sometimes might get flipped, and that's okay. Here, when you're looking at data collection and analysis, this is to figure out what kind of intervention you need. But don't forget, a lot of times we're going to collect data on the other side of that as well to see how did it turn out? Is it working? Are we on track? Pre-test, post-test kind of strategy. So again, this is kind of, it can be changed and stages can move forward and backwards. All right. I'm kind of highlighting here for you the groups of what we're looking at and kind of our direction, but I just said it anyway. Okay. So designing interventions. All right, my Zoom controls were in my way. So this is actually just a copy of what is in your book. And if you have whatever edition that we're working off of currently, the 11th edition, this is on page 151. So it's figure 7.1. So I just put it in here to give it to you sort of, where you can see it on your screen, especially if you don't have a digital book. And you can kind of just look at, this in a different way than just flat on your page. But what this is, it's looking at different aspects or contexts where they're relating to certain cultures, right? So we know that culture is a really important part of organizational dynamics. We tend to look at culture through organizational behavior. However, it's a big part of organizational development as well. So we need to kind of understand how they connect. And what this figure is showing us is areas that fall under organizational development. Where are they more prominent? Which cultures, which countries? So it gives you the context here. And then, I'm sorry, it gives you the value. I keep saying context, I was looking here, but it gives you the value here. And then the definition. So I'm not going to go through these word for word. And then the extremes, basically examples, right? And then where we would see these. So if we look at, I am going to just take context for a second, the extent to which words carry a meaning of a message and how time is viewed. So this is at the high end where we see it a lot in Asian and Latin American countries, and then lower Scandinavian and United States. So, if you travel or if you work with people in different countries and cultures, time is a big thing, right? So in the United States, typically we tend to, or traditionally have tended to lean towards timeliness. If we set a meeting for 10, then everybody should show up at 9:55 by the latest, and it should start at 10, right? And in some cases, you're there at 9:45. In other countries, if you set a meeting for 10, people might be walking in at 10:15, 10:30, and then that meeting may start, anywhere from 10:15 to 11 or whatever, depending on the culture, right? So there is a lot of overlap, and we talked about this in week 1 between organizational development and organizational behavior. We also talked about change management last week, but that OD-OB connection. So while culture is definitely housed under organizational behavior, there's a big intersection here with organizational development. And the other one that I'm going to just bring our attention to is this last one. So individualism, the extent to which people believe they should be responsible for themselves and their immediate families. And you can see that this is highest in the United States. I'd be willing to bet that there's probably some other countries where it's pretty high too. But because it is so high in the United States, I just wanted us to kind of look at this one as well. But basically that accountability and, we are responsible to get our work done, etc. It'll be interesting to look at this, maybe in 15 or 20 years and see how this is all shifted and where we're going, because our workforce, our society is definitely changing. Will we end up somewhere else on this chart? I'm just going to open this up for a second. Does anybody who's on the call tonight have any thoughts, comments, questions about any of these on here?
I would say that Eastern European countries are definitely moving away from a lot of that collectivism that we had because of the communist. I'm saying we as part of that group.
Sure.
Uncertainty avoidance is definitely still low on our part. Power distance, it's hard to say. I was looking through the work of Professor Javidan. He published a lot of work around this, and he emphasizes that European countries need to be reviewed because of the change 30 years ago, and many of them are falling in different kind of baskets now.
Sure. I mean, that's a great point. Just visually in 1999, so it was 10 years out of communism for most of the European countries or Eastern European countries. And I was driving from, I was in Czech, and it had already, it was obviously split. So I was in Czech, and when I was there, it was very gray and dismal, and you'd walk into a restaurant and you may or may not get served, you may or may not get helped in a store. It was very, it felt like it was still stuck in communism. I was actually there working on a project for businesses that had been family owned and taken over during communism and then given back post-communism, except when they were given back, bank accounts were empty, machinery hadn't been kept up. The family now, a few generations later, didn't know how to run the business as they had before. And so we were there to kind of help write business plans and figure out funding to get them back on track. And there was still that hold of communism. And then I drove into Slovakia, and the first thing I saw was a colored billboard. I was like, oh my gosh, there's color in this country. And then I drove into the kind of the main strip in Budapest on that same day. We were just kind of moving through. And it was the Texas Grill and Kentucky Fried Chicken and Burger King. And I was like, whoa, they swung way the other way. Like they were over here. Interestingly enough, I had the opportunity to go back to Czech just 3 years later in 2002, drastic difference where there had been empty storefronts and just damage in the buildings and not, there was no turnover there. In that 3 years, I came back and it was in a place where that was pretty desolate. Previously, there was Hermes and Louis Vuitton. I was like, whoa, okay, now like big, now it had become a real tourist central area. So to what you just said, Victor, I didn't live through it there, but I feel lucky. I don't know if that's the right word, that I got to kind of see it firsthand and experience it in that way. So thank you for bringing that up.
Sure. And I lived through that.
Yes, I know. Yeah.
And that's actually very good observations. It was pretty dark and gray in the 90s, and then color started appearing. Yeah, sorry, not distracting you anymore.
No, I'm glad. I was just going to ask if my assessment was accurate. So I'm glad to hear
to the point. Yep.
All right, so this, again, this is an interesting aspect because we all live through culture. Did anybody else have anything to add into for this one? Okay. All right, so we are going to move to the next slide here. So I'm going to move my little Zoom guys down. All right. This also is right from your book. So figure 7-2 on 158 in the 11th edition. And so this one, it looks a little different. The shapes are a little different than the boxes that are on the page, but same idea. And what I did with this one, so I just want to go to my 158. And then here I tried to put, I'm just going to see if I had changed any of it to try to, let's see. So change. Okay, oh, here we go. Yeah, so just to try to provide a little bit more of what we're looking at when we're looking at each of these categories of interventions. And remember, the one, where you're kind of staying away from for this class, not staying away from in terms of learning and reading, but staying away from in terms of what you're going to be doing for a project, et cetera, is the change management. So if we just kind of stay away from that, but all right. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to actually click down. I was trying to move my Zoom. If I'm asking you to mute, I'm sorry. Everybody should be muted, but when I click on my Zoom thing, I keep accidentally clicking ask to mute. All right, so during this course, you're obviously thinking about an organization that you have a connection to, whether it's where you work now, previously, or some other type of organization affiliation, but you're keeping that organization in mind and thinking about an intervention that might make sense for whatever's going on, either, at either level, so, or any of the 3 levels. So sort of small group, department level, or it can be organizationally, either way. And tell me, just based on your 2 weeks and the reading that you've done so far, does anybody have any thoughts or ideas? And you don't have to, don't identify your organization or anything, but does anybody have any thoughts about directions they might be heading in with any of these yet?
Dr. B,
Yes.
I'll be talking about career planning and leadership development.
Okay. And when we look at this here, tell us, to give us a little more on that.
Sure, the organization that I will be working on has been through the 2008 recession, and then the General Motors and Chrysler bankruptcies, and then coming out of that, growing and going into 15 years of robust growth through acquisitions. And the organization has completely depleted its leadership bench. So as we have issues with current managers and maybe need to upskill or upgrade, we don't have anybody to step in. And we have actually halted acquisition talks because of concerns about who's going to run something new. So we're at a point now where it's sort of an inflection point, right? Where we're doing some leadership training, very tactical and technical, but we haven't really gotten too deep into leadership development plans. So sort of full-blown development plans, which would probably lead into career pathing.
Okay, perfect. So would you say, well, I don't want to say it. You tell me.
That's okay.
Which category would you be under? Where does this fall?
The human resources interventions.
Yep. I didn't want to put it in your mouth, but yes.
Mhm.
Okay. Yep. Perfect. Okay. Thank you. Anybody else have any ideas of where they're headed with their direction yet?
Kirby, I was thinking about highlighting my experience for team management, switching from performance appraisals to ESAT, employee satisfaction surveys. Is that something that falls under human resource interventions then?
So I'm
Or
not,
human process interventions?
yeah, so I was just gonna say, I'm not going to tell you where you should
okay.
put it, but because, so in week 2, you're almost, I don't want to say you're guessing, but you're kind of making an estimated, guesstimate of where you think, what kind of intervention and where you think it falls, et cetera. As you walk through, you're gonna have another chance. I forget which week it is, and specifically, it's not next week, it might later. Where you can come back and say, okay, now, based on what I realize now and have learned, this is where I am, this is where it's housed, et cetera. Because there's so much overlap, Victor, typically there's not going to be a wrong answer. Does it fall under human process intervention or human resource intervention? Well, there's probably a lot of gray area there. But I think as you kind of keep reading and keep trying, you may come to a realization of, that's what it is. So I don't want to give you anything because it may not be right or wrong, but let's see where you evolve. If you're still stuck in 2 weeks, then come back to me. But I think you will kind of figure out where you think it falls.
Yeah, thank you. I realized from your answer that I picked a good topic, so I can lean there or there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to here. So, types of organizational issues that, this is basically that last slide kind of explained in words a little bit more. So again, I'm not going to read this fully, but Victor, this might also help too, just kind of looking at it in a different, view. And again, a lot of this information, all of this information is in the book too. So you may have read it, but sometimes just seeing it differently or on a different day, different hour, makes, triggers something a little differently. But basically, many students tend to wind up in these top 3 areas, right? Because we're going to try to stay away from the change piece here, even though I would say all interventions represent some kind of change, right? You're trying to make a difference, you're changing something. But remember, when we looked at it last week, strategic change or change management is really looking at kind of a one-off, like we are making this change and it's a specific like project basically. Whereas when we're looking at the interventions, we're looking at something to make a difference in an organization, kind of change the overall effectiveness and the way we work. Technically, we could get away with strategic change interventions in this course and not overlap it with a specific change management project. But it would be, sometimes it's hard to differentiate. So we just try to stay away from that one. All right. This is also in your book. And, I told you that this course has a lot of reliance on the text. I think the text is very strong. And I'm not looking to recreate the wheel when we go through things, but I do, sometimes I will put new things on here, but I want to be able to just discuss them as opposed to when you're by yourself reading it in the book. I like this chart a lot because I like that it gives us the 3 levels, right? This is always what we're looking at in org development, the individual, the group, and the organization. Typically, you're not going to be doing an intervention for one person in this course, especially. But like I said earlier, small group or department or organization as a whole. That's kind of how I view this as opposed to one specific person. So small group or, like a sector of a department or a whole department or an organization. And then why are these so important? What is important about them? So this, just kind of goes through some of the obvious things and, what's the point of doing one of these? Enhancing performance. That's probably the overall goal of most of OD, right? We want long-term enhanced performance and effectiveness within the organization. Everything else that falls under that kind of feeds the enhancing performance piece, right? When you see employee engagement, I feel sometimes that this can be confusing because isn't that organization behavior? Isn't that what that's all about? Employee engagement. So why do we keep seeing it over here? So again, like we talked about last week, a few things. when we learn something in school, and I don't care if it's elementary through doctoral programs, right? It's mostly very textbook. This is what the textbook definition is. This is how we treat it in a textbook in, academics. And then in the real world, we don't call it any of these things, or we call it something, different, or we call them all this one thing or whatever. There's so much overlap. So while there's overlap, the difference with the employee engagement in OD is kind of looking at how it relates to the organizational effectiveness, not just sort of that morale piece, which is a lot of what we look at in OB, right? Kind of improving the morale and employee engagement leading to better performance for those employees. Yes, but here our focus is in performance of the organization and overall effectiveness. My next slide here, this is actually your rubric for the case study. And I just put this up in case anybody has any questions, because this will be our first case study in this class. And, it's built just like all the other rubrics, so it should be pretty easy to follow in terms of, how to read the requirements. I will say, always be careful, and I have to do this as an instructor as well. Sometimes professionals on the right, like the best scores on the right, and sometimes it's on the left. And sometimes, these, again, they go in all different orders. It may not mean level of importance here, but just be careful with this. Obviously, if you read no summary provided, you would know that's probably not the best one, but when you're looking at it and you learn, sometimes, just be cognizant, sometimes they're flipped. Does anybody have any questions or comments on this here? And if you haven't even looked at the case study assignment yet, no problem. It's only Wednesday. Okay, so that is all for us for this evening in terms of our recorded session. So if anybody watching this recording has any questions, please feel free to reach out.